Thor is not only back, but he's back in shape. Seems like the God of Thunder is still on his quest for casual adventure throughout the universe and has spent his free time shaking the chains of some unknown huge space beast to restore his boulder-like stature. Seriously, that type of chiseled marble has to have taken a long time. And while Thor worked on getting his biceps to look like tree trunks, a new mighty Thor has taken his place. That's right, Jane Foster is back in the MCU, and the teaser trailer we just saw ends with the reveal of Jane in her full superhero transformation, complete with a restored Mjolnir. But hey, if you're asking yourself, wasn't Mjolnir crushed with the stone-cold grip from Hela out in that grassy field in the last Thor Ragnarok movie? What gives? Well, there's a lot of different reasons for how Mjolnir could have been restored, and the first one I want to talk about is the simplest. Jane's worthiness is what put it back together. Now, as this list goes on, there'll be wild, classic comic book explanations for what we may see happen, but for now, let's keep the focus on Jane. A clue to the hammer's reconstruction might link to comic Jane's arc. So in the comics, Jane is diagnosed with breast cancer and has to undergo treatment for it. During this time, the OG Thor found himself unable to lift his hammer because of something Nick Fury whispered to him, and it was bad enough that Odin's son suffered a mini crisis and doubted everything about himself, leaving the hammer without a proper user. Then what happens is that a sickly Jane hears the hammer calling to her, and she's inclined to go toward it, where she's able to pick it up and become the mighty Thor. Cool, right? Well, there is a catch. Whenever she uses the hammer to become mighty Thor, it basically expunges all the chemo in her body, so when she returns to her normal self, she's still just as sick. But that's all more or less a story for a different time, as now we're talking about the hammer. Notice how the hammer was the one to call Jane to it, so maybe the film will do something similar. Maybe Jane will be drawn to the spot where the hammer was destroyed, and it will reassemble for her because of her newfound worthiness. This explanation gives the hammer more agency than ever before, and could be a cool way to provide a new spin on the whole just a big superhero with a hammer type of thing that we've seen Thor use. By giving the hammer a deeper personality, it not only gives a deeper look into the mythos and true powers of the hammer, but also provides a pretty solid reason on how the hammer can be reforged. Another option to consider is that the hammer was able to be reformed because it's technically not Mjolnir anymore. Let me explain. So in the comics, there's a massive battle where everyone thinks Mjolnir won't last much longer. It only has a little bit of strength left to vanquish the bad guys, and Jane uses it with the belief that her time as Thor and being a superhero would be over. But that's not exactly the case. The hammer actually melts into a liquid gold type of substance and attaches and bonds itself to Jane. Long story short, it turns into Underharnd, the all-weapon, and Jane takes on a new mantle of Valkyrie. Anyways, it's revealed that the true core of the hammer Jane was using wasn't even really a hammer. When I say all-weapon, I really mean all-weapon. In the comics, Jane had the ability to use her new Underhand and make any weapon that she wanted. She could have a hammer, yes, but she could also make things like a mace, a sword, an axe, a pair of wings, anything she wanted. I like this concept for Thor Love and Thunder because it allows us to see the next evolution of the hammer and gives Jane an awesome power. It's sort of like Tony Stark's basically magical nanotech that can form any weapon, but this one is a specialty gold Asgardian weapon. Imagine if Mjolnir is able to reconstruct itself to bond with Jane because it actually has the special properties of Undharnd. Again, that's a logical explanation and lets Jane have her own specialty weapon that's different than what came before. It also continues what I said in the previous entry about giving the hammer more agency overall. The whole point should be that this isn't just a normal hammer. And hey, I've been talking about giving the hammer a bit more personality, but there is a downside to that, because there is a way to reforge the hammer that has a slightly more sinister slant than the entries I've talked about before, and that has to do with the god Tempest. So for those that don't know, the reason Mjolnir is so powerful is that Odin once trapped a powerful cosmic storm called the god Tempest into the chunk of Uru that would eventually be forged into Mjolnir. Now, when the hammer was first forged, its powers were almost too much for even Odin to control, and that's why so many enchantments and spells were eventually placed on it. So what if this history ties into Thor Love and Thunder a bit? Picture this. So after Odin dissolves into dust in that peaceful green cliffside and not in some dirty New York City alley like in the original draft, the magic that Odin had placed on keeping Hela locked up disappeared. So by that logic, maybe some other enchantments wore off too upon Odin's demise. Maybe the backstory is relatively the same and the essence of the god Tempest was unleashed when Odin evaporated, and somehow a group like Valkyrie and the new Asgard Asgardians were able to contain the essence again in the hammer state. The only issue is that they need someone worthy to wield it now that Thor is off on his own adventures. I would nominate Meek, but I guess he doesn't have the arms to wield the hammer. Anyways, maybe this is where Jane comes into the story, and she uses the hammer to help keep the god Tempest locked away inside and funnel its powers through her. Yeah, that has some narrative and pacing issues, but I like the idea of some all-powerful force inside the hammer that needs someone like Jane to keep things steady. If we're still throwing out some fun options, then I say, why not have Doctor Strange be responsible for putting the hammer back together? There is comic precedence to this. One time, when Mjolnir was destroyed thanks to a battle between Thor and his resurrected grandfather Bor, Doctor Strange was there to tap into Thor's Odin Force, and use that power to restore the fragments back into the hammer. The Odin Force is the power of the All-Father, and it's most likely what we saw Odin evaporate into. It's incredibly powerful, but the MCU hasn't really touched upon its full potential. So here's another scenario that I think could work. So because Doctor Strange loves showing up in other people's movies and especially likes to annoy Thor, maybe he'll show up again and use some of the Odin Force that's inside Thor like in the comics to recreate Mjolnir. But here's the fun twist. Maybe because Doctor Strange is sometimes terrible at spells, something happens where a piece of Thor's soul goes into the new hammer. This piece would be some of Thor's emotions and represent the love for Jane Foster that still resides in Thor's body. And with that now inhabiting the hammer, that's what causes the hammer to call to Jane and allow her to lift it to become the mighty Thor. Come on, that would be interesting, right? Or this could be all Loki's fault. And for once, I don't mean that in a bad way. This one will be quick because it would be hard to fit into the story, but I would really like the idea of Loki in his multiverse-hopping adventures thanks to his solo TV show finds a way to bring back a Mjolnir to our universe with the hope of reconciling with his brother Thor. And the glowing blue cracks that we see in the Love and Thunder teaser just has to deal with the hammer being from a different universe. Is it a long shot? Yes, but there would be something so joyous about Loki reuniting with Thor and bringing a present like Mjolnir. Or, you know, sometimes there's a simple explanation for everything. I've been listing all these wild, far-out theories about how exactly Mjolnir would be pieced back together, but I'm overlooking an important aspect. Maybe they just made another. In Infinity War, Thor's whole subplot was about traveling to Nidavellir and asking Eitri's help in forging Stormbreaker. Thor got the forges started and the fires burning and even took the brute force of a star in Infinity War. Pretty metal if I do say so myself. So now that Stormbreaker is made, maybe this was the push to help get Nidavellir back in action again. And as a thank you, Eitri reforges Mjolnir from the pieces that were left behind, leaving it perfectly suited for a new mighty Thor. Overall, I just want Nidavellir to have a larger impact on the MCU because if those fires were to get up and running again, the universe could be populated with some truly amazing mystical weapons. So I've been talking about this the whole video, so I might as well devote an entry to it. Maybe there's no grand reason or explanation for how the hammer is put back together. Maybe it's not Jane's worthiness or Thor's interference or anything like that. Maybe the hammer is able to self-repair itself. Outside of any wacky, complicated backstory on how the hammer slowly pieced itself back together, maybe they just say that the hammer wanted to be put back together, and therefore, it happened. Everything I was saying about giving the hammer a bit more of an in-depth look would be fulfilled if they did things this way. That way, you can still prove the hammer has a personality of its own without making it a big thing. I mean, Gore the God Butcher is here. As important as how the hammer got put back together, don't we all just want to see Jane instead just in the middle of fighting, smashing everything with the weapon? I know I do. So, after discussing the curiosity regarding how the hammer was reforged, the question becomes, what happens next? Where would you like to see the story go? Would you rather continue with following Thor on his aimless space adventures, or would you rather shift focus entirely to the new mighty Thor and watch her protect what's left of Asgard? Should Mjolnir stay a hammer, or should it transform into something else entirely? Should we be exploring the hammer's origins, or at this point, do we just trust it's a giant smashy toy and leave it at that? I don't think there's actually a wrong way to go about it. Sounds like a win-win-win-win situation.